Welcome to Case in Point, produced by the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I'm your host, Felicia Lynn. Today we're talking about the U.S. criminal justice system and wrongful convictions. Joining us in our studio is Jason Flom, a music industry executive and chief executive officer of Lava Records. Jason is also the founding member of the Innocence Project and the host of the podcast, Wrongful Convictions. Also joining us is John Holloway. John is Associate Dean and Executive Director of the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice here at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. So Jason, I'd like to start with you. Although your father obviously was a prominent attorney, you took a different path and became a successful music executive. How did that path get you to working on wrongful conviction and actual innocence cases?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I am the proud black sheep of the Flom family, and as a college dropout, I'm pretty thrilled to be here talking about criminal justice at Penn Law. It's an honor for me. I fell into criminal justice reform in the early '90s just by serendipity, really. I read it. I happened to pick up the New York Post one day, which is not something I do, but the Times was sold out. And there was a story about a kid named Stephen Lennon who had been convicted of first offense cocaine possession charge in New York State and was serving 15 years to life under the Rockefeller drug laws. The reason it was in the paper was because his mother had been petitioning for clemency. He had already been in for 8 years. And she had gotten letters from the judge, the warden, the various local politicians. She even got Geraldine Ferraro to write a letter to then Governor Cuomo, the first Governor Cuomo, and she had been turned down. So the headline was Cuomo denies Ferraro bid for drug dealer parole or druggie parole or something. He wasn't convicted of dealing; he was convicted of possession. And I just freaked out. I didn't know anything about mandatory sentencing at the time. But it just the unfairness, the radical unfairness of the situation, and unfairness is not a strong enough word, just hit me like a ton of bricks, and I decided I had to do something. Long story short, I ended up getting a pro bono attorney, the only defense attorney I knew at the time, which I happened to know because I'm in the music business, and I represented a couple of rock stars back then who were always getting in trouble. Scott Weiland from Stone Temple Pilots and Sebastian Bach from Skid Row. So I got him to take the case. His name was Bob Collini. He took the case pro bono, and we ended up winning his freedom. And so it was a cathartic experience sitting in the courtroom holding his mother's hand when the charges were reversed.
And so why now you are well versed in the field of criminal justice, exoneration, actual innocence. Why this new venture of telling these stories through a podcast? So I started this podcast, Wrongful Conviction, because I wanted to get the word out there of these incredible stories and these incredible people, the exonerees. I've become very close to many of them because of the fact that I've done, let me backtrack. I'm a founding board member of the Innocence Project, so I've been with them for a long, long time, and I've been particularly involved in post-exoneration work. So I started the Life After Exoneration program at the Innocence Project, also founded the Innocence Network Conference, where we bring the exonerees together for sort of a weekend of healing and stuff. And so I wanted, their stories are so mind-blowing and so important. And they are so, as I said, they're so extraordinary that I just thought, what a great way to get those stories out there in the realest way possible. And for me, I love to talk, as you can tell, and I love radio. Yeah. So it's it's really sort of it's a thrill for me, or an honor, I should say, to be able to, help spread the word. And so how do you decide among all of these cases that you must work with? How do you decide which ones to highlight in the podcast?
That's a good question. It's a hard thing to decide. We're focusing on the major causes. There's so many causes of wrongful convictions, right? Everything from bad forensics to mistaken eyewitness identification to police and prosecutorial misconduct to bad lineup procedures. I mean, there's so many things. False confessions. So we want to cover the spectrum, and my hope is that in doing so, we will educate and inform the audience which, let's face it, everyone who's listening, and everyone who's listening right now is a potential juror.
Right.
So my hope in doing the podcast is that when people end up serving on a jury, if they end up on a on a criminal case, that they'll take a more informed view and a more, frankly, a more skeptical view of the proceedings in front of them, and not accept at face value what the prosecutor or even a forensic, quote, expert, government expert is saying, just because they're saying it. And that in that process, one life will be saved, and one innocent person will walk free. And of course, then there's that other side of it too, right? Which is that what we know is that by definition, when you convict an innocent person, the guilty person is free to commit more terrible crimes and wreak havoc on society. And that's what happens, because we know that with the Innocence Project, in over 50% of the cases in which we've exonerated the innocent person, we've also identified the actual perpetrator by getting a DNA hit. And that person, in almost every one of those cases, has gone on to commit more crimes, and brutal crimes. And those are victims that never needed, those are crimes that never should have happened. So I think that I'm very happy that the podcast Wrongful Conviction is getting a significant level of traction. And therefore, the more people that listen to it, the more people that hear it, the greater the chance is that trials will be conducted in a fairer manner.
So you chose Raymond Santana for your inaugural episode of Wrongful Conviction. He's one of the Central Park Five. And it's incredibly powerful to hear his story, right? Particularly because that conviction was based on a false confession. And I think a lot of people wonder why anybody would falsely confess to something that they didn't do. When you start to hear Mr. Santana speak about his prolonged interrogation as a teenager, it becomes much more clear why somebody would end up confessing to something they didn't do. So what, if anything, did you do to prepare him to tell his story on your podcast?
I know Raymond. I've seen him speak before, so I knew that he was he's very focused. He has his shit together. Mm-hmm. Let's just say that, right? And so I wasn't concerned about that. I talked to him, before we went on the podcast for some time about what we were hoping to accomplish, but. In general, the exonerees are almost disarmingly calm, graceful. They have an ethereal lack of bitterness that is, it's really something to behold. And every time I'm around them, I get an amazing degree of gratitude in my attitude, right? Because, I'm not religious, but for the grace of lowercase God go I, right? So, but anyway, the false confessions thing, I'm glad you brought that up, because it is the most powerful evidence that a prosecutor can have. We've seen cases like Jeffrey Deskovic's case where DNA evidence was presented at his trial by the defense that proved that he wasn't the guy. And the jury believed the false confession over the DNA evidence. And the fact is that with false confessions, they happen typically after long interrogations, because guilty people will normally confess relatively quickly, because why they want to waste their time sitting in that room? It's very unpleasant, right? Whereas in Jeffrey's case, in Raymond's case, in Raymond's case, he was interrogated over 15 hours without any food, without sleep, because he was arrested at night. So this went on well into the next afternoon. He was 14 years old and 90 pounds. He was, the only adult he had in the room was his grandmother, who, as he says in the podcast, she couldn't speak English. She could only curse in English. Right. And so, and they would pull her out of the room, and then they did the whole good cop, bad cop thing. And I said to him, by the time he confessed, I said, you would have confessed to kidnapping the Lindbergh baby. And he was like, absolutely. Like anything they wanted me to do to make this stop. And so, but you can't, but nobody, it's very hard for anyone to process the idea that someone would totally fuck their own life, right? Because you can't, it doesn't make any sense that anyone would falsely confess until you understand. There's a psychological protocol called the Reed method, which was developed in Chicago, I think in the 60s, which is designed to elicit confessions. It's not designed to get the truth. And, when you have someone who has particularly teenagers or adolescents, whatever, anyone under the age of 20 is particularly susceptible to sometimes being convinced that they did the crime that they didn't do. People actually could come out of there thinking they did it. But you're so terribly overmatched in that situation, and they eventually get you in such a corner that you see no way out, and then they offer the prospect that everything's going to be good if you confess.
But I think what you're speaking to is kind of the power of these individual stories to kind of illuminate broader systemic problems that are going on. And John, I think that kind of ties in nicely with what the Cutrone Center is trying to do here. So how do these individual stories kind of fit into the work of the Cutrone Center with its systems approach?
Well, I think the Cutrone Center, it probably is not a reach to say the Cutrone Center would not exist but for the work that the Innocence Project and folks like Jason have done to raise awareness about the fact that errors exist and to bring forward cases where there are clear errors. So one of the advantages of the New York Innocence Project's focus on using cases where DNA can conclusively prove or disprove innocence is that DNA and the data that it provides is objective. So, once you've got a DNA hit that shows that the person who committed this crime is not the person that we've convicted, it's not really a question of he said, she said anymore. There's something objective and scientific to look at. And that then has the real power to change people's perspectives, because people who have a belief now find that belief debunked by data. So the Cutrone Center, I think, was sort of a natural, let's build on that. We see this increasing number of exonerations. There's now very close to 2,000 of them have been cataloged by the National Registry of Exonerations. We're adding them at something like 3 a week. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that they're happening fewer and fewer. It probably means that we're just getting better and better at identifying them. But again, that's part of the process that builds as we learn more about what the hallmarks are. If you see a case now where a false confession is the main foundation of the prosecution's case, and you look at that false confession and it's somebody who is under the age of 20 or over the age of 60, if it's somebody who was interrogated for more than 6 or 7 hours at a time, in the most extreme case, Jason mentioned that prosecutors are allowed to lie in the interviews. One of the more extreme cases is a California case where a prosecutor actually created a fake DNA report. Wow. Put it in front of the person he was interrogating and said, "We've got your DNA," and then that DNA report found its way into the file. Wow. So a ruse report, it's called, right. And so even that is permissible. Now, using the reported evidence, which was done in that case, that's still pretty clearly a no-no. But just to show those things and being able to tell those stories is extraordinarily powerful then in explaining to people who don't believe that it really can happen in our system. And I think it's wonderful that people have faith in our system. I think that's the key to its legitimacy. But it's also key to its legitimacy that the system be willing to take those stories and learn from them. And what we try to do at the Cutrone Center is to show that these stories are not isolated, but then also to gather data about the information and figure out how that data can be applied to prevent the next error. So a litigation-based strategy like the Innocence Project, I think, is wonderful to both expose the existence of mistakes or errors or misconduct in the system, and it's also great to provide some measure of justice for those errors, to free those people who are incarcerated. Given how long that takes, it often doesn't then lead to immediate reforms to prevent the next error. And that's really where the Cutrone Center comes in, is we take these cases where there have been errors and we go use root cause analysis and sit down with the representatives in those jurisdictions. And most of the time, it's not the same people that were involved in the case, because, in Raymond's case, there was how long was it before he was exonerated?
It was, I think, 14 years later.
Right, so 14 years. Or John Thompson in New Orleans, who I wrote a book about, was 18 years for him to be exonerated. And so by then, all the people have moved on to other jobs, they've moved on to other offices, there's new elected officials in all of these positions, or appointed officials, new chiefs of police, new DAs. And so you sit down with those people and you have conversations about how these things are still going on in their jurisdictions, and can't we make some changes to prevent this from happening again? Because the assumption is that nobody, and this is, you know, what you'll hear is no police officer wants to put the wrong person in jail, no prosecutor wants to convict an innocent man, and I believe them when they say that. So the question is, how can we now gather more data than these individual stories and use that to design useful reforms that will prevent the next error from happening?
And as you say, this data is more objective, so it feels less adversarial when you present data rather than maybe a litigation strategy or a legal argument.
Yeah, so very much what we're doing is not, I mean, in a sense, it's advocacy oriented in that we're advocating for the system to work the way that it's designed. But it's not advocacy oriented in that we're taking a prosecution or a defense mindset. What we're saying is, look, people commit crimes, and people who commit crimes need to be held accountable, right? We could fight about whether possession of small amounts of marijuana should be criminal, right? Or we could fight about whether, if you're caught with drugs, what would be a useful intervention, right? Is it useful to incarcerate you versus put you in a diversion program? Those are things that I think reasonable people can fight about. I don't think anybody disagrees with the idea that before we impose a sentence, we should make sure that the person actually committed the crime, right? And that if we did that wrong, that we need to fix that. And so the core idea of the system is get the right guy in the right way. Make sure you have the person who committed the acts, and that you didn't violate the Constitution in doing so. And that is not a prosecution or a defense issue. That's a justice issue that I think everybody agrees with. And so long as you're not about winning a case, but you're about getting to the truth and accurate result in a case, then the kind of data that we're going to bring and the stories that Jason is telling come together really in a really compelling way to not just compel people to then want to change the system, but to do so in a meaningful and useful way.
But I'm curious because I'm thinking about, Jason, what you just said about how some jurors will hear a false confession, they'll hear DNA evidence that exonerates a defendant, and they'll still believe the false confession. And I'm thinking about even for some people who will not accept the results of a DNA exoneration, and our new president-elect, who publicly called for the return of the death penalty for the Central Park Five, still refuses to acknowledge the validity of their exonerations. So is that kind of reaction common? And why do you think that these types of cases, these types of exonerations, can be difficult for some people to acknowledge?
Well, the prosecutors don't like being proven wrong, and they will resist. Sometimes they'll look at the case of Tony Wright, right, which happened recently in Philadelphia. It took us 8 years to even get the DNA tested because they didn't want us to test the DNA. Right. So if you're after justice, why would you not want to test DNA, which can only prove conclusively guilt or innocence, right? If you're guilty, you're guilty. The DNA is going to say that too. So it's a very puzzling thing to me. I think, we'd need a psychologist here to talk about why that happens. I think that, prosecutors have a difficult job, and sometimes I think they get caught up in it. There are certainly a lot of very good prosecutors out there, and we need them. But there are also some very bad ones, and they're capable of inflicting terrible damage on people who are actually innocent. And in many cases, they know that they're innocent, right? And that's where we see these civil rights cases happening, where you have prosecutorial misconduct that leads to a wrongful conviction where, exculpatory evidence is withheld. It's hard to think of a justification for that. And anybody who watches TV knows that you have to turn over exculpatory evidence. Of course, that Supreme Court decision has a strange caveat in it, right, which gives them sort of a little bit of an out, which is troubling and puzzling to me. But nonetheless, it's something that I'm very happy to see the work that Quattrone Center is doing, which is making a difference in that area. And to what John was saying before, one of the things at the Innocence Project, the micro stuff is extremely gratifying. It's so wonderful to see the exonerees out and doing the best they can to return to some semblance of a life. And in many cases very successfully, but it's obviously hard. But when my dad was the legendary lawyer Joe Flom, and when he died, I established a position at the Innocence Project in his honor. So it's the Joe Flom strategic litigation position, and we have a wonderful guy named Chris Fabricant. The reason that position exists is because Chris takes individual cases and then drives policy change using those stories. So, for instance, we recently had a ruling in the highest body, judicial body in Texas, I'm forgetting the name of it, where they made a strong recommendation. I don't think it's an absolute rule that bite mark evidence can no longer be used in court after we had an exoneration of a guy who served 26, 27 years having been convicted on bite mark evidence. And I think we're on the verge of doing the same in Virginia with the Keith Allen Harwood case, where Keith would serve 34 years in prison based on bite mark evidence that, of course, we now know is junk science. I mean, it doesn't get junkier than bite marks. Bite marks, it's interesting, I think, the bite mark evidence only exists, forensic odontology exists because in cases of natural disasters where bodies are obliterated, right, a plane crash or anything else like that, where you really can't identify the individuals, you get a full set of teeth and you compare them to dental records, and you can identify that person. You bite with a couple of teeth on an imperfect surface if you're biting someone, and that evidence, I mean, we've seen cases where it was later proven that the bite marks were animal bites, not even human bites. And we did a test in Texas where we had 100 forensic dentists and odontologists, and we gave them all a test, and the answers differed so wildly that finally the high court decided that, or the high body, whatever. I'm really frustrated. I can't remember what I should know because they did great work here.
Forensic Science Commission? I mean, there was a litigation as well, but I think the Forensic Science Commission, too, has said in the state of Texas that, and they've really, that body, I think, with a lot of assistance from Chris and his team, has made a lot of really good forward-looking policies on how they're going to deal with not just bite marks, but arson cases, hair follicle cases, and a lot of areas that are really coming under question as being junk science today.
Right. The hair evidence stuff is another thing that was driven by the Innocence Project, and where the FBI has agreed to reopen thousands of cases cases in which hair evidence was the primary cause of conviction, or a primary cause of conviction, because we examined, I think it was 396 cases, 394 cases, there are 92 cases anyway, and we found that in 96% of those, the FBI forensic expert either lied or was mistaken. And of the 28 experts who had testified in those cases, 26 of them were complicit in this. So it's possible that they were all innocent mistakes, but it seems unlikely because every mistake they made was in favor of the prosecution. And so there was a joint press release from the FBI, the DOJ, the National Academy of Sciences, and the Innocence Project, where they acknowledged these findings and agreed to reopen I believe it's thousands of cases based on hair evidence. So that kind of macro stuff is so important, and it goes back to what John was saying. The micro stuff is more sort of satisfying in an interesting way, but the macro stuff is going to, help exonerate many more people and also prevent future wrongful convictions from happening in the first place.
So we've talked about DNA exonerations, false confessions, some of this junk science. Are there any other prominent causes of false or wrongful convictions?
I think that probably the largest, it's not uncommon when you have a case where we're able to determine that things have not been done accurately or correctly, that there are multiple of those factors involved. And this is not unlike a wrong side surgery in healthcare, where when you track it backwards and you ask, how did this happen, you get lots of contributing factors. So, but I think in addition to the things that you've mentioned, mistaken or inaccurate eyewitness identification is probably the most common factor in these things, and that can be due to a variety of reasons. As with false confession, where one of the underlying issues with false confessions is that police and trained investigators have and most people have a very, very strong belief that they can tell when somebody's lying, and in fact, they can't. Human beings can only tell if somebody's lying about 50% of the time, right? So it's just like flipping a coin. And even if you're trained in the study of telling whether people are lying, when we look at FBI agents and police, they're in the 57 to 65% range. So there's these core beliefs that we have about our own abilities to discern certain things. And in the false confession, it's the belief that we can tell whether people are lying. In an eyewitness identification, it's that our memories are like permanent records, when in fact our memories change over time and they're very fungible based on other factors. Plus, we think that we're better at identifying. It's a fact that people are not as good at cross-racial facial identification. It's a fact that if we are getting a lineup and one of us knows whether the suspect is in the lineup, the other one isn't, the person who knows can give away things even without speaking a word that communicate cues to us about what the desired result is, and that may impact who we pick out of a lineup. And these are things that can happen without anybody having any bad motive, but nonetheless can color an examination. And so eyewitness identification, the use of jailhouse informant testimony is another big one that we see in a lot of these cases. And it's probably...
We've now changed that word, sorry to interrupt you, John, from jailhouse snitches to now incentivized witnesses is what we call them.
Incentivized witnesses, there you go. Well, and sometimes that'll happen. So in a lot of these cases, you'll see a reward that's been offered, whether it's through Crime Stoppers or through the family of the original victim, and people will respond to that financial incentive. And so incentivized witnesses, I like that term. Because it does sort of get to the key. And an incentivized witness is not necessarily an untruthful witness, but it means that you really have to probe deeper. And that has to be made very clear in the process. And a lot of what we see is we see allegations that are, the witness had an incentive and nobody knew what that incentive was, or the incentive was openly denied on the stand, notwithstanding the fact that it existed. I mean, in Orange County, the entire DA's office just got disqualified from a capital case because it was revealed that they had a history of cultivating jailhouse testimony, and in fact a log of the different jailhouse snitches or incentivized witnesses that they were using, and they denied its existence.
And not only that, John, but to take it one step further, what they were doing was they were, after a lawyer has been assigned to you or you've hired a lawyer, that's no longer allowed, right? Jailhouse snitches actually are legally permissible, right, in court prior to you having had a lawyer. So it typically happens when you're in jail, awaiting trial, or before you've lawyered up, so to speak, right? But in that case, it was after people had already had obtained representation, when it's patently illegal to use jailhouse snitch testimony.
Well, and so while what's happening in Orange County is probably the most extreme use of this, think about what it means now when in a capital case, and this person is being charged with multiple murders. In a capital case, the jurisdiction that brought the charges is now disqualified from pursuing that case. And think about what that does to the community, right? So this is something that I think ultimately, if I'm one of the thousands of dedicated prosecutors out there, I'm horrified by this. It makes it harder for me to do my job, and it undercuts the safety of the people of Orange County, that they can't prosecute this death penalty case effectively, because now they have to bring in an outside prosecutor and deal with all of that. So they're not insignificant. The impact of it is not insignificant, and to everybody's detriment.
For me, it's so crazy when you have everybody who's ever watched a crime show on TV pretty much knows that you cannot bribe a witness, right? But the government can and does, and they can offer the best bribe in the world, which is a get out of jail free card. They can literally go to you and say, we're going to drop the charges. All you have to do, and like in the Sonny Jacobs case, right? They went to this woman who was charged with passing bad prescriptions and said, this woman, Sonny Jacobs, killed 2 cops. You're doing society a favor. All you have to do is tell us that she said that she did it, and your felony, charges will be dropped. And so that woman went and did exactly that, and it led to Sonny being sentenced to death, and ultimately serving 17 years before she was exonerated. Because that's a hell of an offer, right? To drop felony charges or to reduce your prison sentence by years. And then, as John said, the fact is that if that happens and it is legal, I don't think it should be, but it is, that must be disclosed to the jury. And prosecutors have openly lied on the stand, and during the trial, not on the stand, but and said that there was no incentive, there was no deal when there was. And of course, we have a case going on in Texas now, the Michael Morton case, where that was discovered later. And the Cameron Todd Willingham case is a great example of that. So anyway, so back to what you were saying.
I was just going to say that in many ways, you would hope that prosecutor offices would support the work that both of you are doing, because it does, as you say, make their jobs easier if jurors have faith that the system is working the way it should, and they have confidence that the evidence that they're hearing is reliable.
Well, and I think many do, right? I mean, to be really fair, the Innocence Project's been doing this for getting close to 30 years now.
25. This is our 25th anniversary coming up.
Okay, and I think in that time there's a much greater awareness. And one of the things that you see that we've published on is conviction integrity units or conviction review units that are propping up, and there's about 30 of these now across the country in many of the larger and predominantly the larger DA's offices, but also some of the medium-sized ones. And I think those are institutional responses to the Innocence Project and the Innocence Network and the 55 chapters of the Innocence Network nationwide. Now you're having prosecutors who say, you know what, this is not just a defense responsibility. You know, we're ministers of justice. That obligation extends beyond the conviction. If somebody has a plausible claim of actual innocence, we want to create a part of our office that's dedicated to reviewing that. And most of those offices have hardworking, talented, good faith prosecutors who recognize that mistakes get made, right? And that some of those mistakes are going to be honest and some of those are going to be misconduct, and each of those has to be handled differently, but both of them have to be acknowledged and managed. And so I think we are seeing an increasing number of prosecution offices who are willing to have those conversations. Not everyone. You know, there's a spectrum of sort of early adopters and those who kind of drag their feet. And nobody likes to talk about errors that happen, especially, you know, if you're a prosecutor, you're going to define yourself. Your professional identity is, I get it right every time. That's what I do. And it's a very difficult thing, I think, then to face that despite your best efforts and that deeply held self-identity, that nonetheless a mistake might happen on your watch. But you know, we're having an increasingly broad number of prosecutors coming to our symposia, learning about these issues, and I'm very encouraged by the growth in the response that we're seeing.
Of course. Jason, what happens to exonerees after they're exonerated? I know that's a pretty blanket statement, but having worked with so many, what is their life like post-exoneration?
That's a question, that's one of the most frequently asked questions, and after this, all these years of working in this area. And the fact is that, tragically, almost 35% of them get no compensation at all, and we're talking in the long run. The ones that do get compensated typically have to wait years to receive their compensation, and even then, the level of compensation that they do receive varies wildly. There are some states where the most you can get, I think in Wisconsin, the most you can get is $25,000. And then in Louisiana, I think it's $150,000, but it's paid out over 10 or 15 years. So it's almost like, you know, we're going to really, like, we're going to inflict poverty on you. You know, Doug DeLosa, an exoneree who I've interviewed on my show and who I'm very close to, served 14 years in Angola. And he got $150,000 from the state. He spent $287,000 on lawyers. So he, in fact, paid almost $10,000 a year to be locked up in arguably the worst prison in America. So, you know, then there are others who actually can get, if you can prove civil rights violations, you can have a significant claim, and you can end up getting money that you can live on, as the Central Park Five did. And certain states have better statutes than others. It's something that we're working on. 20 states have no compensation statutes, which is, you know, bizarre. And like in Wisconsin, if you accept the $25,000, you forego your right to any future claims, which is, of course, like another version of kind of like a fuck you. You know what I mean? Like, really? I mean, for 25 grand, and you lock me up for how many years? And like, it's really, it's another area that needs a lot of work. It's interesting because going back to what John was talking about, Texas is one of the more, you know, progressive states on this. And it's important to recognize that there is a coalition of the left and the right in this area, right? There's a lot of conservatives who, well, they don't like mass incarceration if they're, if they have a libertarian streak, right? Then they're, and in general, they're against big government. Some conservatives are still in favor of locking everybody up, and some Democrats are too, but which I find bizarre. But the fact is that there shouldn't be any disagreement about the idea that we don't, as a society, want to convict innocent people and let guilty people go free. And when I see these cases in which there's, sort of a willful cooperation on behalf of law enforcement and prosecutors' offices to lock up somebody because it's convenient, even though they know that they're innocent, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a special place in hell for people like that. I don't, and I've seen it too many times to be able to accept. I can't accept it.
Well, I think you're right. I think these are bipartisan issues, and Texas is a unique kind of place for some of these issues. But anytime you've got the ACLU and the Koch brothers on the same side of an issue, that suggests a very broad cross-section of the population sort of agrees on them. And so, the idea that in Texas, for example, they really don't like criminals, and they're willing to impose significant penalties if you're guilty of a crime, but they really don't want government in their kitchen. And so you better get it right? Or we're going to make sure that you do. And that seems like a reasonable way to shake it out to me, to say, every jurisdiction can decide what the penalty should be, but we're only going to impose that penalty when we are absolutely certain that we're right, and we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that we are right, including changing policies where we can find evidence that we're doing it wrong. So, this should not be something that changes, every 4 years or every 8 years, as the case may be. This should be something where we're doing what was done in aviation and in healthcare, and we're creating cultures where we can learn from these cases in a cyclical way, because we are going to keep making mistakes, and as we change policies, they're going to have ripple effects, and we're going to have to study the impact of our reforms and make sure that we're making the system a better place. It's implementing that culture that I think becomes key to this, and that will actually, we have a large segment of this population that has lost faith in the criminal justice system, and I think what you're seeing is anger at the legitimacy of the system. I was speaking to a former state police trooper from New Jersey who told me that he thought the reason you were seeing more violence at traffic stops is that the people who are pulled over are resisting the idea that these police officers have the legitimacy to pull them over. And when that starts happening, when we lose that fabric of trust and belief in the legitimacy of the system, that's when we start seeing cities get lit on fire. And so we've got to restore that trust and that legitimacy. And that's going to require a certain amount of transparency and accepting accountability for what we do and for changing our behaviors when we get something wrong.
I think, I want to just point out, we can't have a conversation like this without talking about the death penalty, because so many of our clients have been sentenced to death for crimes that they didn't commit. We've exonerated 20 people who are on death row, and we know that there have been innocent people executed. And we can't, it's like Brian Stevenson says, right, the great attorney and civil rights leader. If we know now that we're getting it wrong at least 10% of the time, and if planes crashed, if 1 out of every 10 planes crashed, no one would fly, right? So the problem is, how can we accept that we're executing innocent people? Even if you think the death penalty is morally okay in extreme cases, and some people do, then you have to be willing, if you support the death penalty, you have to be willing to accept the idea that we're going to, the fact that we're going to continue to execute innocent people. And I can't accept that. And this, of course, was a very bad election cycle for the death penalty, because in California, of all places, a referendum passed, the Speed Up the Death Penalty referendum passed, which has so many terrible aspects to it. I mean, they have basically made it virtually impossible to appeal a death sentence effectively in ways, so many ways. You can look it up. I'm not going to get into it now. But it's really a tragic turn of events. And of course, in Nebraska, we had a bizarre situation where the legislature overturned the death penalty and abolished it. The governor vetoed it. They overrode his veto. And then the governor, who's a billionaire, financed a referendum himself I know, you're shaking your head, and I'm inside, my guts are coming, like, I'm ready to puke in my mouth. But, and then he financed the referendum himself, and it passed. So, the death penalty thing, and John Thompson, our mutual friend John Thompson, is a great example that he came within a month of being executed, and the prosecutors knew he was innocent. And he wrote that phenomenal piece, which I hope people will look up, in the New York Times. He wrote an op-ed piece in which he asked the question, why is the prosecutor not being charged with attempted murder? He knew I was innocent, I've proven that, and he attempted to put me to death. And that's really, you'd sit there and scratch your head and go, Jesus Christ. I mean, it's really sort of, it's a very difficult thing to process as a human being, with any degree of empathy at all. Right. You can't, or even just, I mean, any moral compass whatsoever. Right? So there's that. Now, one bright spot, I think, and there are more than one, but one bright spot that I think we've seen, and it leads to a question that I think we should talk about too, which is what can people do? And one of the things people can do is vote bad actors out of office, right? I mean, these guys have to run for office, some of them. And we've seen in Cleveland and in Chicago, that's exactly what happened, right? They didn't want to prosecute the cops who killed Tamir Rice. Guess what? You're gone. And the same thing happened in Chicago, where we now have a district attorney, Kim Fox, fabulous. I saw her speak. I was like, that's funny actually, because I got to show you my shirt. I'm wearing a shirt that says "I met God, she's black," and Kim is who I had in mind, or one of the people I have in mind when I wear that shirt. She's phenomenal. And so, we do have power. I mean, these elections are generally have relatively low turnouts. So if everyone can get off their ass and go vote in those elections and put people who are progressive and justice-minded and not, ideologues or zealots or whatever the hell you want to call it, in those positions, it'll make a huge difference. I mean, Chicago's going to be a different place with her in there. And and we all have to. I mean, the ubiquity of video cameras is now going to, I believe, and I hope, is going to lead to systemic change. Certainly, we never would have known about a lot of these cases if not for the Tamir Rice video or some of these other ones. So that's a bright spot. Death penalty bad, new prosecutors good. At least those two for sure.
Video and other tools for transparency and information, good. Obviously issues with implementation that we have to deal with, and the real world has a way of creating complexity in these large agencies and bureaucracies. But I agree with you about Kim. I think she's fabulous, and really looking forward to working with her to understand what's going on in her office and help her implement the stuff she wants to do.
Well, thank you both for joining us for a great discussion.
Thank you for having us, and please check out my podcast, Wrongful Conviction. It's available on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and iHeart, and you'll hear some stories that will really blow your mind.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us on Case in Point.